Ezra Cole was 40 years old when his wife walked into the offices of Hargrove and Associates on a Monday morning in Charlotte, North Carolina, and told an attorney named Dennis Hargrove that her husband was a middle-income logistics coordinator with no significant assets, no business interests, and no financial standing that would complicate a straightforward dissolution. She said this with the confidence of a woman who had lived beside a man for 9 years and had concluded that what was visible was all there was. Dennis Hargrove had listened, had taken 3 pages of notes, had asked several clarifying questions, and had agreed to represent her for a retainer that reflected his assessment of the case as uncomplicated. Then, because Dennis Hargrove had been practicing family law for 22 years and had a standard intake procedure that he applied without exception, he had returned to his office after the meeting and had typed Ezra Cole's name into a search engine. He had looked at the results for 4 minutes. Then, he had called his paralegal into the office, had reviewed the results with her, and had placed a call to Simone Webb, his client, and had explained, in the careful language of a professional who understood that the information he was delivering was going to require revision of everything she believed, that the case she had described to him and the case that actually existed were not the same case. He had withdrawn from the matter the following morning. He had refunded the retainer in full, which was not something Dennis Hargrove had done more than twice in 22 years. What his search had returned, what Simone had not known to look for because she had never thought to look, was the public record of a company that bore Ezra Cole's name in its founding documents. A company that had been acquired 18 months earlier in a transaction that had generated coverage in 3 regional business publications and 1 national trade journal, a transaction in which Ezra's founding equity had been valued at $6.8 million. Simone had been in the house during the entire period that company was being built. She had been present for all of it, without understanding any of it. She had called her husband worthless to a man who had the internet. What happened next would be the most expensive search result of her life. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Ezra Cole had grown up in Greensboro, North Carolina, in a house on Guilford Avenue that his grandmother Mabel had kept since 1972. A craftsman bungalow with a deep front porch and a kitchen that had produced every significant meal of Ezra's childhood with the kind of consistency that was not about the food, though the food was excellent, but about the regularity itself, the dependable presence of a place and a person that meant the world had a center, and the center held. Mabel was 80 years old now and still in the house on Guilford Avenue, still making the same coffee at the same time each morning, still attending the same church she had attended for 53 years, still keeping the front porch in the condition it deserved to be in, which was to say swept and composed, because Mabel believed that the face a home showed the street was a form of communication, and that she had things to communicate. Ezra visited on the 1st and 3rd Saturday of every month, and had done so since he moved to Charlotte at 26, and had decided that the distance was manageable enough that there was no excuse for not making the drive. He had worked in logistics software for 17 years, starting as a systems analyst at a regional freight company and moving through a series of roles that were progressively less defined by title and more defined by the specific ability he had developed for identifying the gaps between what a logistics system claimed to do and what it actually did when the variables of real-world operations were applied to it. He was good at finding gaps. He was better at filling them. The software company he had started in 2017 with 2 colleagues, a developer named Priya and a systems architect named Marcus, had been built around a methodology Ezra had developed for diagnosing inefficiency in last-mile delivery networks. A methodology that was both proprietary and demonstrably effective, which was the rarest combination in a field where most solutions addressed the symptom and left the underlying architecture unchanged. The company had grown from 3 people working out of a shared office space in Noda to 18 people in a proper office in South End over 4 years, had attracted 2 rounds of institutional investment, and had been acquired in a strategic transaction by a national logistics technology firm in the autumn of the previous year. Ezra's founding equity, 31% of the company at the time of acquisition, had been valued at $6.8 million in the transaction. He had received the majority of that in cash at closing, with a structured earn-out arrangement for the remainder that was performing ahead of schedule. Simone had known he was building a company. She had known the way a person knows something they have been told, but have not chosen to fully understand, with sufficient awareness to confirm the fact if asked, and insufficient engagement to understand what the fact contained. She had attended one investor meeting in the company's first year, at Ezra's invitation, and had found it tedious, and had said so on the drive home, which had been the last time Ezra had extended that invitation. She had heard the names Priya and Marcus enough times that she could have identified them in a room. And she had met them at a company holiday gathering in year 2. And she had been pleasant, and then she had been done with the subject, in the way that people are done with subjects that do not intersect with their primary interests. Her primary interests were her own career in interior design, her social commitments, and the management of a household she had reorganized twice in the preceding 3 years in ways she found significant and Ezra had found neither significant nor troubling, because he was occupied with other things, and because a man who is building a company in the evenings and weekends while holding a consulting role to maintain cash flow does not always have the attention for household reorganization. The household had begun to feel, in the year before the acquisition, like a space he was passing through rather than inhabiting. Simone had developed a social network that did not include him except at specific occasions that required his presence. She had a clarity about what she wanted from her life that had grown increasingly specific, and that he had begun to understand no longer included him as anything other than the financial substrate, the steady background presence that made the life she actually wanted possible. He had noticed this in the particular way he noticed inefficiencies in systems, without panic, with documentation, with the patient accumulation of sufficient data before any conclusion was committed to. He had discussed what he noticed with no one except his attorney, a woman named Laurel Finch, who had been handling the company's legal work for 3 years, and whom he trusted with a completeness that reflected how thoroughly she had earned it. He had called Laurel in March, 2 months before the acquisition closed, and had told her what he was observing and what he expected might follow. Laurel had listened. She had asked 4 questions. She had said, "Let's make sure the timing and the structure are correct before anything else moves." The acquisition closed in September. Ezra received the cash portion of his equity in September. The structure of his personal holdings, the manner in which the proceeds had been received, the entities involved, the timeline of the transactions, had been organized by Laurel and by his financial advisor, a methodical man named Gerald Park, with the specific care of people who understood that a financial event of that magnitude, arriving in the context of a marriage that was approaching its conclusion, required documentation of extraordinary clarity. Gerald had said, when they were reviewing the final structure in August, everything needs to be clean enough to survive a forensic accountant. Ezra had said, make it cleaner than that. Gerald had made it cleaner than that. He had made it so thoroughly documented that the story it told was not the story of a man who had hidden something, but the story of a man who had built something, beginning before the marriage in its current form, and continuing through it, and arriving at a valuation that was the direct result of work Simone had had every opportunity to observe and had chosen not to. He had told Simone he wanted a divorce on a Thursday evening in October, 3 weeks after the acquisition closed. He had done this calmly and at the kitchen table, which was the kitchen table she had chosen during one of the household reorganizations, and which he had found neither good nor bad, but simply present. The way most of the surfaces in the house had become simply present. Objects in a room he was passing through rather than building toward. He had cooked dinner that evening, which he still did on Thursdays, because he had always done it on Thursdays, and changing the Thursday dinner would have been a performance of a decision he had not yet officially made, and he had set the plates on the table, and they had eaten, and then, he had said, with the same directness he applied to everything that deserved directness, that the marriage was finished, and he wanted to proceed correctly, and he had retained Laurel Finch to manage his side of it. He had given Simone Laurel's card. He had answered 2 questions. He had noted that she looked, in the moment after he spoke, not surprised, but recalibrating, the expression of someone who had been expecting a conversation and had expected a different conversation than the one that had arrived. He had left the kitchen. He had gone to his office. He had closed the door with the quiet precision of someone who understood that the closing of a door could be a statement, or simply a door closing, and who intended the latter. He had opened the document he had been building for 4 months, and had reviewed it once more, and had been satisfied that it was complete. Simone had apparently chosen Dennis Hargrove based on a recommendation from a friend, and she had apparently walked into that meeting with the conviction of someone who had taken the measure of a situation and found it straightforwardly in her favor. He could not fault the conviction entirely. What she had seen for 9 years was a man who worked long hours and drove a sensible car and declined most invitations to social events that did not involve the company he was building, which she had treated as evidence of limitation rather than as evidence of investment. She had looked at the surface and had written the assessment from the surface and had not looked for the second floor. The second floor, it turned out, had been there the whole time. His coffee grew cold the morning she was supposed to meet with Hargrove. He had not known about the meeting. Specifically, he had known, because Laurel had advised him to expect it, that Simone would retain counsel, and he had known that the counsel she retained would, upon performing the basic due diligence that any competent family law attorney performed, discover the acquisition. He had not known it would happen so quickly. He had found out from Laurel, who received a call from Dennis Hargrove's office on Monday afternoon, informing her that Hargrove was withdrawing from the matter and would not be opposing counsel in any proceeding. Laurel had called Ezra and had described the situation with the precise brevity of a woman who appreciated its significance, without requiring theatrical language to convey it. He had listened. He had said, "Thank you." He had sat for a moment and had thought about Mabel's front porch on Guilford Avenue and the way it looked in the afternoon light when he pulled up on the first Saturday of a month, the same as it had always looked. Swept and composed, communicating the thing it had always communicated. He had picked up his coffee. He had gone back to work. Laurel Finch had been practicing corporate and family law from an office in uptown Charlotte for 18 years. She was 49 years old, organized in the specific way of someone who had spent 18 years managing both the technical complexity of business transactions and the human complexity of the disputes that arose from them, and who had developed as a result the ability to hold multiple registers of a problem simultaneously without confusing them. She had reviewed the full financial picture, the company's founding documents, the equity structure, the acquisition terms, the cash disbursement, the earn-out schedule, the personal financial architecture Gerald had built, and had prepared the financial disclosure that would be filed with the dissolution petition with the same standard she applied to the most complex corporate transactions she had handled, every number sourced, every claim documented, every timeline supported by contemporaneous records. The disclosure was 43 pages. It was complete. It was, as Gerald had promised, cleaner than clean. Gerald Park was 57 and had been managing private client finances in Charlotte for 29 years, with the methodical patience of a man who had learned early that the most important financial decisions were the ones made before the event occurred, rather than after it, and who had applied that principle to every client relationship he had maintained long enough for it to matter. He had organized Ezra's financial holdings before the acquisition, during it, and after it with the specific intent of producing documentation that was both accurate and unambiguous, not to conceal anything but to ensure that when the story of what Ezra had built was told in a legal proceeding, it was told completely and in the correct order, which was from the beginning, which was before the marriage, which was when the methodology that eventually became the company had first been developed on Ezra's own time, and at Ezra's own initiative, and without contribution from anyone who was not named in the founding documents. Gerald had presented the full summary to Laurel in a meeting that had lasted 2 hours, and had ended with Laurel saying, "This is the clearest financial picture I have worked with in 18 years. Gerald had said, that was the intention. They had shaken hands and moved on. Ezra had driven to Greensboro on the first Saturday after Dennis Hargrove withdrew from Simone's case, and had sat on Mabel's front porch with his coffee, while Mabel sat in her customary chair, and they had talked about things that were not the divorce, and then about things that were. Mabel had listened to the full account with the patient completeness of a woman who had been listening carefully for 80 years and had never once confused what she heard with what she had expected to hear. When Ezra finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the street. She turned to him. "Your grandfather, Arthur," she said, "spent 30 years building a printing business that nobody in this neighborhood thought was going to amount to anything, because they looked at the shop and they decided what they saw was what there was." She picked up her coffee mug. He used to say, "The ones who count what's visible will always miscount what's real." She drank. He was talking about money. He was also talking about everything. She set the mug down on the arm of her chair with the careful precision of a woman who had placed that mug on that arm for 40 years without spilling it. "Your mother never fully understood what you were building either. She called me once to ask if I thought you were wasting your time." She looked at him directly. I told her, "Ezra has never once wasted his time." She didn't understand what I meant. She paused. "You always did." The dissolution proceeding was straightforward in the way that proceedings become straightforward when the documentation is complete and the legal representation on both sides is competent. Simone retained a second attorney, a woman named Patricia Howe, who was experienced and professional and who had evidently advised her client, upon reviewing Laurel's 43-page disclosure, that the case she had believed she was entering and the case that existed were two different things requiring two different sets of expectations. The mediation took place 6 weeks after Laurel filed, in a conference room at a building on Tryon Street. Patricia Howe had reviewed the disclosure. Simone had reviewed the disclosure. The number on page 4, $6.8 million, the acquisition valuation, had been reviewed in the context of what was marital and what was separate, which was a distinction Gerald and Laurel had documented with the specific care that distinctions of that magnitude deserved. The earn-out schedule had been reviewed. The structure of the personal holdings had been reviewed. Simone arrived at the mediation with the composed attention of someone who had spent 6 weeks recalibrating. She had revised her understanding of the situation in the way that intelligent people revise understandings when the data requires it. She looked, to Ezra's eye, less like someone who had been wronged and more like someone who had been wrong, a different condition with a different quality of expression. He recognized it. He felt no particular satisfaction from it. He had never needed her to understand him. He had only needed the work itself to be real and documented and correctly presented, which it was. He waited for the right moment, which arrived after Laurel and Patricia Howe had exchanged their opening positions and the first round of responses had been delivered, and he looked across the table at Simone directly. "You told a lawyer I was worthless," he said. His voice was even and carried no heat. "I understand why you believe that. You watched me build something for 9 years and you decided what you saw was what there was." He set his hands flat on the table. The error wasn't in looking. The error was in stopping. He let the room hold the silence for a moment. "I never needed you to understand it while I was building it. I just needed the building itself to be real. It is real. It is documented. It is on page 4. He nodded to Laurel. He stood. He walked out. The corridor outside the conference room was carpeted and quiet. The elevator was efficient. Outside on Tryon Street, the October air was cool and carried the specific quality of autumn in the Carolinas. Dry, slightly sharp, clarifying in the way of seasons that have arrived in their correct order after long preparation. Ezra stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about Mabel's front porch and the first Saturday of next month and the drive up 85 that he had been making for 14 years and would continue making. Because certain things were worth the drive and always had been. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. 13 months later, Ezra Cole was in his new office on the 4th floor of a building in Noda, the same neighborhood where Priya and Marcus and he had first rented desk space 7 years ago. Because the neighborhood had a quality of practical energy that he associated with starting things correctly. And starting things correctly was what he was doing. The new company was smaller than the last one. 4 people, deliberately, and was applying the same diagnostic methodology to a different segment of the logistics ecosystem. One that Ezra had identified during the earn-out period as underserved in the specific way that the last-mile delivery network had been underserved 7 years ago. The earn-out payments from the acquisition were arriving on schedule, which Gerald had noted in a recent summary, with the same muted satisfaction with which he noted all things that arrived as projected. The personal financial picture was settled and documented and managed with the care of someone who understood that what you build after a significant event is either built on the foundation of what you learned, or it is not built to last. The dissolution had concluded 8 months prior. The settlement had been fair and documented and final. Patricia Howe had been professional throughout. Simone had relocated to Raleigh, where she was running her interior design practice and where, from the distant and undetailed reports that reached Ezra through mutual acquaintances, she was doing work she found meaningful and living a life that was organized around what she actually wanted. He wished her no specific outcome. He did not think about her with any particular regularity. The marriage had ended correctly, and the documentation of its ending was as complete as the documentation of everything else, and Ezra found a kind of abstract satisfaction in that completeness, the way he found satisfaction in any system that had been closed correctly. Naomi Garrett was a supply chain consultant he had met at a regional logistics conference in March, where she had given a presentation on network resilience that had contained 3 specific insights Ezra had not encountered in 17 years of working in the field. He had introduced himself afterward, and it said, "Your 3rd point was wrong." She had looked at him for a moment, and it said, "I know." I included it to see if anyone was paying attention. He had found this in the specific register of someone who had spent his career in a field full of people who performed insight rather than practiced it. Genuinely remarkable. They had talked for 2 hours in the conference hotel lobby and had continued the conversation over email for 3 weeks and over dinner twice, and had arrived, without urgency and without announcement, at the natural state of 2 people who find each other's minds consistently interesting and have decided to keep being near each other. She was not in the office this morning. She was on a client site in Raleigh, which was the kind of coincidence that Ezra noted without meaning and did not track for significance. She would be back Thursday, He had a meeting Thursday afternoon that would run long, and she had plans with a friend in the evening. Friday, they were having dinner. That was the shape of it, and the shape was correct. Mabel had met Naomi at the first Saturday visit she had attended, 2 months prior, and had served her coffee in the good cups, which Mabel reserved for people she intended to take seriously, and had asked her 4 questions about her work, and had listened to all 4 answers completely. Afterward, standing at the kitchen counter while Naomi was in the bathroom, Mabel had turned to Ezra and said, "She counts what's real." He had said, "Yes." Mabel had said nothing further. She had gone back to the counter and had begun, with the purposeful efficiency of a woman who did not waste the good cups on people who did not warrant them, to prepare the cornbread she made on first Saturdays, which was always better warm and always ran out before anyone was ready for it to, and which Ezra had been eating at that table since before he was old enough to understand how much it would eventually mean. Some things you build once, and they last. Some things you build once, and you understand them better the second time. The ones worth building are always both. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.